And some of your publications talk about cancer as a metabolic disease, and specifically a dysfunction of the mitochondria. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so this goes back to the work of Otto Warburg in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, where he defined that cancer originated from damage to mitochondria. And that then elicited a whole series of changes, forcing the cell into a fermentation mechanism to survive. And we have validated and confirmed Warburg's original finding. So in order to do that, what I did was to go through the scientific literature, looking at electron micrographs, the very high magnification of mitochondria in tissues, because you can't see them under light microscopy. In order to look at the structure of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell, you really need electron microscopy, scanning electron microscopy. And then when you look at, so what I did is I went and I looked at all the major cancers, probably representing 95% of all cancer deaths caused by these kinds of cancers. And I went back through the 50s and 60s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, because in a lot of medical schools, people would be looking at cancer tissue with electron microscopy. And then you go to those papers and you look and see what they found with respect to the number and structure of the mitochondria in those tissues. And invariably, they were abnormal structurally. And even if one were to isolate them and look at the biochemistry, it was abnormal. So we have never found normal mitochondria in any kind of a major cancer. Okay, so if you don't have normal mitochondria, that means the cells are not going to be able to generate energy through normal respiratory systems like oxidative phosphorylation. And this is exactly what Warburg said. He said mitochondria, oxidative phosphorylation, becomes irreversibly damaged in all cancers, regardless of where they come from, thereby forcing them into a fermentation mechanism. And that's what the characteristics of all cancer cells are. They ferment. And then what we did is Warburg knew glucose was the lactic acid fermentation derived from glucose was the major fuel at that time. We have now defined glutamine as a second fermentable fuel. The field had thought for many years that glutamine was being respired. No, it's not respired, it's fermented. So the two fermentation fuels that drive the majority, if not all cancers, are a sugar fermentation and an amino acid fermentation. And without the glucose and glutamine, no cancer cell can survive. So our goal is to scientifically validate fermentation mechanism for a glutamine and show how Warburg was right on his original description, but he also did not have new information which would clarify and resolve this entire cancer issue. And we're in the process of doing this right now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so what are some of the things that can disrupt the mitochondria to make them precipitate cancer, and how does that go about? I've seen some of you talk about how this actually precipitates the genetic mutations that we see and attribute blame to as a causative, but you're saying that that's actually a knock-on effect.
Yeah, so mutations are all downstream epiphenomena, as are most of what people are studying today. Are all downstream. The angiogenesis, the failure in apoptosis, and all these kinds of things, they're all downstream of the original damage to the mitochondria. So to answer specifically your question, it's called the oncogenic paradox. And this paradox has perplexed the cancer field for decades. In other words, how is it possible that you could get cancer from a whole range of different kind of insults? What is the common pathophysiological mechanism that could underlie this range of cancer initiators? Like, for example, some people, women may get breast cancer from a clogged milk duct. Another one may get it from some sort of viral infection. Another one may get it from a unhealed wound. There's a whole variety of different ways that could elicit a breast cancer. You can do the same thing. You can consider the same thing for possible colon cancers, or bladder cancers, or lung cancers, or any of these kinds of things. In other words, there's not any one, of course, smoking would damage the mitochondria in certain lung tissues and possibly other tissues, intermittent hypoxia, radiation, chronic inflammation, any of these kinds of insults could damage a cell in a particular tissue, damage the mitochondria of a cell in a particular tissue, leading to dysregulated cell growth in that tissue. And the definition of cancer is cell division out of control or dysregulated cell growth. How does that happen? It happens from damage to the mitochondria in a particular cell or populations of cells in a particular tissue, eliciting a growth, a dysregulated growth. And that's the oncogenic paradox. So you don't always get cancer from a single insult. It could come from a variety of insults. The bottom line is that you end up with cells that are dysregulated in their cell growth, all of which are fermenting. And it's important to recognize that the mitochondria of our cells is the controller of the cell cycle. So when that organelle becomes defective, the cell falls back into a dysregulated cycle, leading to, and this is the way all cells on the planet evolved before oxygen came into the atmosphere 2.5 billion years ago. Mm-hmm. We had living cells on the planet before oxygen was in the atmosphere, and they were all fermenting, and they all had dysregulated cell growth. So the cancer cells in bodies are simply falling back on these ancient pathways that have always existed even before respiration, even before the origination of the mitochondria. Mm. So the cells are just simply falling back. And as long as they have fermentable fuels in the environment, they're very difficult to kill. Radiation and chemo and all these things that we use are not at the heart of the problem. And as a matter of fact, some of the standards of care actually facilitate the availability of fermentable fuels, making the management of the disease impossible. Mm. So that's why the current standard of care makes no sense when one considers the origin of the disease in the concepts of evolutionary biology.
Yeah. I did read a study, a number of years ago where it spoke about, when people go into a ketogenic diet, and it's speaking specifically about using ketosis in order to fight cancer and talk about mitochondria specifically, and showing that when in a state of ketosis, your mitochondria, first of all, were more efficient, and they also increased in number. And so, and it's this sort of mechanism that would protect from cancer. What is it about eating carbohydrates and not being in ketosis that just jams up our mitochondria so much?
Well, I don't think the carbohydrates jam up the mitochondria. Mm-hmm. What happens is excessive amounts of carbohydrates facilitate it causes an inflammatory condition in the body, and it's this elevated inflammation, the state of an inflammation that contributes to the damage. So, sugar itself is not a carcinogen. Right. However, chronic consumption of excessive carbohydrates can put the body in an imbalanced nutritional state, and that's what elicits. It's not only cancer. It's type 2 diabetes, it's Alzheimer's disease, it's cardiovascular disease. Essentially, it's all of the major chronic diseases that we are currently suffering from is the result of excessive amounts of carbohydrates in the diet. We as a species did not evolve to eat large amounts of carbohydrates. It was only a seasonal kind of situation. A ripe fruit, a ripe berry, or something like this would be the sweet, maybe honey. It wasn't chronic exposure to high levels of carbohydrates that are coming from the foods that we presently have in our societies. And that is ultimately the origin of the majority of chronic diseases that we have, is a diet that does not fit our evolutionary past.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that.